All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I just wanted to thank the Tool Design and the Michigan Fitness Foundation for working with the city of Ann Arbor this evening on this pedestrian safety campaign. I want to take a couple minutes and just have city staff introduce themselves, and then I'd like to ask Raymond Hess to lead that, and then also have our Vision Zero Implementation Committee members introduce themselves. We'll turn it over to Mary Muma for some introductory slides, and then we'll turn it over to Brian Almdale from Tool Design to kick off our data presentation. So Raymond.
All right, good evening, everyone. Again, thank you for coming this evening. We appreciate and value your time on this important initiative. We'll get into some of the background and history on this, but this is a parallel effort that complements very well the Vision Zero Implementation Committee's work. So that's why we're pulling you into this conversation, because I think it's tackling that education and evaluation piece that is often overlooked. Some of the other discussions we've had are more focused on the engineering and the quick build. So this is really about, what are the things that we can do to enhance some of those implementation measures with, communication, outreach, and how we evaluate the effectiveness of those. So this is a pretty exciting initiative. We're very excited to have been chosen. We are kind of a demonstration community in the state of Michigan. So again, thanks to Mary for picking us, and again, the Tool team as well for helping this effort along. So Raymond Hess, Transportation Manager, glad you all are here. I'll let Suzanne introduce herself, even though you've already heard from Suzanne.
Thank you, Raymond. Suzanne Flowers, Transportation Program Manager for the City of Ann Arbor.
And then Cynthia, how about you take the lead?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cynthia Redinger, and I am one of our transportation engineers here at the city.
All right. And then our fearless chair and co-chair, I believe, are Brett and Julie. Or maybe they're both co-chairs. I don't even know if we have a specific. So maybe Julie, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Julie Boland. I'm on the Transportation Commission and representing one of the representatives for the Transportation Commission on the Vision Zero Implementation Committee.
And like Julie,
right.
I'm on the Transportation Commission. I'm the vice chair. Julie is the chair.
All right, thank you. Ken, let's go over to you.
Hi, I'm Kenny Anderson. I work as a planner for the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority.
And then Devin.
Hey, good evening. My name is Devin Ackman, community member, and I'm also on the Equitable Engagement Steering Committee for the city.
Very good, thank you. All right, who am I missing? I forget, since I don't see Mike's face, I can't remember if he's on the committee or if he's with the consultant team.
Consultant team.
Consultant team, there we go. So maybe with that, I'll turn it over to Mary to introduce the consultant team then.
Absolutely, thank you. And I noticed that somebody, Lillian Webb, just joined us.
Hello, Lillian Webb. I am with the Get Downtown program.
Great, thanks, Lillian. We are actually getting ready to complete introductions. I am Mary Muma. I am the Director of Safe Routes to School with the Michigan Fitness Foundation, and also the manager of this pedestrian education project that we are stepping into with Ann Arbor. I'm going to shift actually over to Chelsea. Chelsea is one of the consultants who is part of this team, and Chelsea, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Mary. Hi, everyone. I'm Chelsea Maupin with Good Marketing. We are actually the next phase after Brian and Jim from the Tool Design team will tell us the data. We are the create messaging and get it into the world of Ann Arbor to make the streets safer from a public education standpoint. So here to hear the conversation tonight and looking forward to working with everyone.
Great. And Jim?
Hey everybody, I'm Jim Elliott from Tool Design. I'm a planner and I'm the project manager for our Tool Design's work on this project, working for the Michigan Fitness Foundation.
And Brian?
Hi everyone, I'm a planner analyst at Tool Design. I'm in the data science group and the sustainable safety group here in Seattle.
And the last in our group, and certainly not least, Mike, are you there?
Yeah, I apologize, Mary. Some of the audio is garbled, so I turned my camera off. I'm Mike Smith, everyone, Transportation Alternatives Program Manager. And I'll just briefly say that previous program before Congress created TAP was Transportation Enhancement. And I say that because that's the funding source for this project. And then Mary might want to mention if there's, I know there are some other funding sources too, but that's my reason is to look at this as an overall grant and its overall management. Thank you.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for being here tonight. I'm actually going to share my screen and we're going to walk through a very quick, my part of the presentation is going to not be as interesting to you because it may be things that you've already heard, but we're just going to do some reminders as we get started tonight. And then I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to share his screen and walk us through what I think is some very interesting data. So I'm going to share my screen and all right. So this is your stuff here from the city of Ann Arbor, moving together toward Vision Zero. And we are really happy to be here making this presentation to you tonight and look forward to your input as we move forward with this project. So there's just a few things for you to know that the video speaking sharing functions are available to the presenters. They're disabled for participants and it just helps keep the feed clean and open for everyone. You can leave and rejoin the meeting or if you get bumped off, feel free to rejoin. You know it's being recorded. And we are doing the communication through the Q&A feature, which is the icon at the bottom of your screen. You'll see it in a minute. And there's going to be a presentation of data, and then we're going to ask some questions at the end of that presentation. If you need clarity or aren't understanding something during the presentation, please type it into the chat right away, and Suzanne, I believe, is going to be monitoring that chat, and so she will help with that clarity. And then this meeting, the recording will be available in about 7 to 10 days, I think is the protocol on the website, and you'll be able to add input via Mentimeter through July 22nd. So if there's anyone here who you think of something after you get home, you can get on to the website and connect to that Mentimeter and even add input after this meeting is over. So the meeting norms for the Vision Zero team is that we're all committed to learning here and we're avoiding speculation. We are encouraging you to ask questions through the Q&A feature during the presentation for clarity, and then we'll have some specific questions that we'll ask you when it's over. Nobody's on the phone right now, but if you are, we just ask, if you do end up having to switch to the phone, we ask you to move to a quiet area to just make sure we can all hear what you're saying. And please remember the rights and dignity of everyone here at the meeting. We are asking you to critique the ideas and the concepts, not the people. And we also ask that you be thoughtful about your language so we can all be comfortable and respectful in this forum. And inappropriate and or verbal comment or language, including personal attacks and accusations, will result in an attendee being removed from the meeting. And so we really don't want that to happen. So we just ask you to bring your best self to the meeting today. So here's just a visual of the technology. You see at the bottom of the screen the chat. Actually, that's not a chat in our webinar tonight. It's a Q&A. So you would look for the Q&A, and then if you are on the phone, it is *9 to access the raised hand. All right, so I'm just gonna talk a little bit very briefly about the Pedestrian Safety Education Campaign. It's a pilot that is going on in Southeast Michigan. It is brought to you by the Michigan Fitness Foundation, MDOT, the funding source Mike mentioned earlier, and the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation has also provided some funding. Supported by our 2 consultant teams who went through a competitive RFP process to be selected for this project, and that is Tool Design and Good Marketing, and we are really happy to have them as partners on this project. The goals of the project are to educate pedestrians and drivers on safety and laws surrounding pedestrian transportation. We want to reduce the total number of pedestrian crashes, fatalities, and the severity of injuries in 3 communities in Southeast Michigan. And those communities are Ann Arbor, Detroit, and Monroe. And Brian or Jim will talk very briefly about that process that we went through at the beginning of this campaign. And then we want to develop a campaign playbook that can be used by other communities. This project was modeled after an initiative called Driving Change that took place in Grand Rapids several years ago, and it was focused on bicycling. And this one is focusing on pedestrians. And our goal again is to have this campaign playbook with everything that we learn so others across the state and even beyond could use it as we go forward. And just working toward that Vision Zero, which is important to the city of Ann Arbor. So now I'm going to actually turn it over to Brian, who is going to share his screen and walk us through all of the data.
Thank you. I just need to get permission to share. You want to see my screen? Excellent. 1 second. Okay, so let's get into it. So today I'll be giving a very brief overview of the pedestrian crash analysis process that was used to, and also share some of the key findings from the crash analysis. The purpose of this crash analysis is to identify key findings related to the who, where, when, and why pedestrian crashes occurred to help inform the pedestrian safety education campaign. This presentation, it won't be focused on infrastructure changes or programmatic recommendations to reduce crash risk, but rather we're sharing what we found so far in the crash data and ask you to potentially fill in any data gaps or refine the findings from this analysis. So asking you, do these results make sense? What are we missing? What should we consider? Anything to help guide the development of the campaign. So beginning with the selection process, we identified 14 locations using the outputs from the various spatial regional analyses that we conducted for the entire Southeast Michigan area. The goal here is to measure pedestrian crashes using different metrics to identify a somewhat broad group of initial candidate locations. We selected a mix of crash density measures, crashes per capita, crash concentrations along the corridors, crashes per mile, crashes by urban, suburban, and rural land uses to help guide this process. Through those steps, we landed on 3 candidate communities: Detroit, Ann Arbor, and Monroe. Following the regional pedestrian crash analysis, we conducted similar analyses for each of those 3 selected communities. To briefly summarize why Ann Arbor was selected, we found Ann Arbor had a relatively high number of pedestrian crashes given the land use context, the population, and concentration of crashes along several key corridors. Between 2015 and 2019, using the study crash dataset, there were 309 reported pedestrian crashes, 5 of which were fatal, and 31 were serious injury crashes. And before I begin, here are some key terms and concepts that I might use throughout the presentation. KSI, or KA, stands for killed or seriously injured, which represents the level of injury severity the pedestrian experienced as a result of the crash. Sample size simply refers to the number of reported crashes that we're analyzing as part of this task. And regression towards the mean is the tendency for the number of crashes to fluctuate over time and can be misleading if this phenomenon is not acknowledged or controlled for. This is especially important for smaller communities with a small number of crashes, or when analyzing specific locations, such as at an intersection or along a corridor. The image that's displayed on the right shows 2 separate 5-year averages with a red line. And while they use the same study period, 5 years, the averages are very, very different. Whereas the longer study period, which is the blue line, tells a very different story. This analysis does not account for regression towards the mean, the analysis I'm summarizing and presenting today, but we do note instances where this phenomenon may be present. Some of the crash data limitations are outlined in the 3 bullets below. Reporting rates is a limitation, and this is related to not all crashes being reported to the police. There are many reasons why someone might not know that they should report crashes to the police, or they're uncomfortable working with the police or communicating with the police. Then there's reporting error, which is related to miscoding of crashes or crash records within the crash report form, or the report form is missing information. And missing information that would affect this analysis could include contributing factors, posted speed limits, traffic control, number of travel lanes, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, there's reporting bias, which is related to specific crash report records that require professional judgment, such as reporting on contributing factors. Our initial step in the analysis looked at the number of pedestrian victims who were involved in crashes. The 2 relevant attributes that are included in the crash analysis are victim age and sex. Race is not included in the crash data, and this is common for it not to be included in crash data. While some jurisdictions in the US do record race, they often have issues with reporting errors or the officer having to report visually, which might not reflect the victim's actual race or ethnicity. Throughout this analysis, I'll be discussing both citywide statistics as well as statistics within a focus area. The focus area surrounds downtown and the university. This focus area was selected because of the high concentration of crashes relative to the other areas throughout Ann Arbor. So to understand who was involved in crashes, we looked at the victim age distribution and compared it to the resident age distribution within Ann Arbor to see if there are particular age cohorts that are overrepresented or underrepresented. So meaning we looked at the number of people within each age bin, about 5 years each, and compared it to the demographic data. And this helps us understand if there is a certain group of people who are involved in traffic-related crashes at a higher rate than other age cohorts. With that understanding, we'll look at citywide victim trends. We saw populations between 20 and 29 and 50 to 59 were generally overrepresented in crashes compared to the community's population during this 5-year time frame. When looking at fatal and serious injury crashes, victims aged between 50 and 54 were particularly overrepresented. Now looking at crashes that occurred within the focus area and around downtown and the university, we saw pedestrian victims representation by age closely resembled the citywide pattern, and that victims aged between 20 and 29 and 50 to 59 are the most overrepresented demographic. Taking the same approach, we looked at the age of drivers involved in pedestrian crashes by age. For citywide crashes, we see drivers aged between 20 and 29 and 40 and 44 years of age are the most overrepresented in crashes. Similar age cohorts are also overrepresented in fatal and serious injury crashes, specifically drivers aged between 20 and 34 years of age. When looking at drivers involved in pedestrian crashes within the focus area, we see departure from the citywide statistic. Where citywide crashes had drivers roughly aged between 20 and 44, being overrepresented in crashes. In the focus area, we see that that age grouping is shifted to older populations aged between 35 and 64. This difference is also noticeable in fatal and serious injury crashes with drivers aged between 25 and 29 and 45 to 64 being overrepresented in fatal and serious injury crashes. Given the absence of detailed demographic data recorded in the crash data, we relied on readily available census data and CDC data. We wanted to see if there's particular communities that face a greater burden related to pedestrian crashes. Here we overlaid and spatially joined crashes to census block groups and looked at the relationship between crash frequency and severity by population of people of color. Here, we did not see a strong association between the percent of a population that's made up with people of color and the pedestrian crashes. Spatially, most crashes are concentrated downtown and near the university, which has a relatively moderate race or ethnicity population mix according to census and CDC data. We also looked at CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, which refers to the potential negative effects on a community caused by external stresses on human health. Such stresses include natural or human-caused disasters or disease outbreaks. Reducing social vulnerability can decrease both human suffering and economic loss. The index is made up of 4 factors: socioeconomic status, household composition, race, ethnicity, and languages, and lastly, housing and transportation. The previous slide displayed most crashes occur downtown and near the university, which according to the CDC, this area has a low to moderate social vulnerability score. When looking at the CDC's race, ethnicity, and language factor, we did see that crashes were slightly concentrated in areas with moderate to high scores for minority languages. The key takeaways, pedestrians aged between 20 and 29 and 50 to 59 were overrepresented, particularly for victims aged between 50 to 54 citywide. Drivers aged between 20 and 44 years are overrepresented citywide, whereas within the focus area, they are slightly older. And areas with a higher share of non-English speaking community members have a higher frequency of crashes. We also analyzed where crashes occurred within Ann Arbor and what type of characteristics were present at the time of the crash. Looking at land use, specifically land uses that are associated with pedestrian activity levels, such as commercial, retail, and institutional land uses, we overlaid crashes on top of readily available land use data at the regional level and measured the number of crashes on a per mile basis. Those black buffers that you see around the center of the map and on the southeast side, you could ignore the buffers on the southeast side. That's technically outside of the study area. Those are the areas that have the highest concentration of pedestrian crashes on a per mile basis. Looking at the map, we can see that areas with the more diverse land uses and land uses that attract or generate pedestrian activity levels had the highest concentration of crashes. And this is most evident by the corridors near downtown and the university, or just generally within the focus area. When looking at the data a little bit deeper within the focus area and looking at the presence of transit stops it became apparent that intersections with transit stops have a higher number of pedestrian crashes in general and a higher number of pedestrian crashes on a per intersection basis, suggesting potentially higher risk or higher levels of pedestrian activity, which is likely associated with just generally higher levels of exposure. Looking at roadway characteristics, we found roads with higher posted speed limits have a much higher pedestrian crash rate on a per mile basis compared to streets with lower speeds. Lower speed roads, while they're accounting for the largest share of crashes in general, they had the lowest number of crashes on a per mile basis. And that suggests that there are lower levels of crash risk along those corridors. Similar to this citywide statistic, the same is true within the focus area. Higher speed roads have a higher number of crashes on a per mile basis. We also looked at what type of road each crash occurred along. For this analysis, we used functional classification, which is associated with vehicle speeds, volumes, roadway size, and the general function of a street. Similar to posted speed, larger and higher speed roads, such as arterials, accounted for the largest share of crashes on a per mile basis. And zooming in a little bit more, the same is true for the focus area with higher pedestrian crash rates along larger streets, such as arterials. We also looked at where crashes occurred, whether it was mid-block or at an intersection. The vast majority of crashes occurred at intersections, particularly at signalized intersections. That doesn't necessarily mean traffic signals are risky or have higher crash risk. It's just that these locations have higher exposure levels as they're generally locations where we have the transportation system designed to encourage pedestrians to cross at those locations. We also see that there's a strong spatial concentration of pedestrian crashes that occurred within the downtown area and within the edges of the university. Yet again, intersections accounted for the largest share of crashes, particularly at signalized intersections within the focus area. We also see that the highest concentration of crashes are along Huron Street and within the downtown area. Some of the key takeaways, pedestrian crashes are more likely to occur at land uses that attract or generate pedestrian activity levels, near bus stops, which is not listed on this list, on high speed and arterial roads, and at intersections. We looked at when these crashes occurred to see if there were any temporal or time-based patterns that were observed in the data. Looking at citywide, there aren't any major surprises here. We see that the bulk of the crashes occurred during the typical AM and PM commute periods, which is generally between 7 and 9 AM and 4 to 6 PM. And they occurred most often during the weekday. Within the focus area, the downtown and near the university, isolating those crashes, we were able to see that most of the crashes occurred during the PM commute period or during the early evening time period. There were fewer crashes that occurred during the weekend, which is likely reflected to lower levels of driver and pedestrian activities that occurred during that time of week. The majority of crashes occurred during the daylight conditions, which aligns exactly with what we would expect, as most trips occurred during those daylight hours. However, we do see that most of the fatal and serious injury crashes occurred during dark lighting conditions, which is meaningful as there are fewer trips that are being made during this time, which means there are fewer opportunities for a crash to occur. Furthermore, when a crash does occur during this time period, they tend to be a little bit more severe than the daylight crashes, with 12% of crashes having resulted in a fatal or serious injury compared to 6% that resulted in a fatal or serious injury during daylight hours. Looking at time of year, crashes are generally concentrated during times of the year when school is in session. Lower crash frequencies during the summer months and higher frequencies during the spring and fall. So the key takeaways for the when crashes happen: pedestrian crashes are more likely to occur during weekdays, during the AM and PM commute periods, and the early evening within the focus area. Across the board, crashes are most severe during dark lighting conditions and happen most often during times of the year when school is in session. We also looked at the reported attributes in the crash records that provide some insight into what behaviors were present at the time of the crash. When looking at reported violations, we need to keep in mind some of the potential reporting issues and data quality issues that we noted at the beginning of this presentation are likely present. Here we saw very few pedestrian crashes where either the pedestrian or driver were under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Very few reported distracted driving citations were issued or were noted, which honestly can be a pretty difficult factor for a reporting officer to prove. So having a low number of these types of contributing factors is not surprising to us. Most crashes were attributed to the motorist not yielding to the pedestrian right of way. 2/3 of the crashes were related to a driver disregarding traffic signal or traffic control, failing to yield, or other risky driving behaviors. And lastly, 14% of pedestrian crashes were coded as a hit and run crash, which is not good, but it's lower than the regional trend. For pedestrian crashes, it's important to look at the movements of the motorist prior to the crash and the location type of the crash. Most pedestrian crashes in Ann Arbor involved a motorist making a left turn, followed by a motorist traveling straight. The left turn crash occurred most often at signalized locations, whereas most crashes with motorists traveling straight occurred at a location recorded as having an unknown traffic control device. These are more times than not a two-way stop-controlled intersection. These would most likely be crashes where a pedestrian was attempting to cross the main road that does not have any sort of stop control, but was struck by a motorist who did not yield or stop for the pedestrian. Looking at these pre-crash movements spatially, we see that most left turn, it might be a little difficult for you all to see in this map, but I think you can zoom in by scrolling in. Looking at these pre-crash movements spatially, we see that most left turn crashes occurred at signalized intersections, most often along primary arterials such as Main Street, Huron Street, and the Collector Street, Glen Ave. Right turn crashes are concentrated at intersections along corridors or collectors and local streets and tend to be less severe. Right turning crashes being less severe for pedestrian crashes is also somewhat expected. Whereas the going straight occurred typically at unsignalized locations and along minor arterials and collectors, there are some corridors within the university that have higher concentrations of going straight crashes. These crashes tend to be the most severe crash type to occur. We also analyzed location type, traffic control, and pedestrian action for each pedestrian crash. And this is helpful when trying to understand if there was any location types and actions that had a high crash frequency, such as mid-block crossings or mid-block driveway crashes, or if a pedestrian was walking in the road. Here we see most crashes occurred at signalized intersections with the pedestrian actively crossing. No surprises. So key takeaways of the why, driver failed to yield was the most reported contributing factor. Left turn crashes and straight crashes are the most frequent and some of the most severe outcomes. And most crashes involve a pedestrian crossing the street. Again, that one's no surprise. With that, I think we could go straight into the discussion. The next at the bottom right, for those who were unable to attend this meeting, you all can go to www.menti.com and enter in the code 6406-6777 and can answer and provide some responses to the bulleted lists, the bulleted questions that we have included on this slide, which the first one is, and we can all begin discussing this first one. Do you have any questions about the crash analysis done for this project?
Brian, I believe Ms. Boland has her hand raised, so I just wanted to give our committee members an opportunity to ask questions as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted a clarification, Brian, is dark lighting, does that mean that it's dark outside, but the place where the accident happened has a street light that's lit? Is that what that means?
That's right.
And Jonathan Levine?
So I infer, thank you for that very informative presentation. I infer from it that actual red light running is not that much of an issue, but what's a very common issue are turns where the driver has a green and the pedestrian has a walk signal, whether a left turn or a right turn. Would that be a correct inference from your data?
With the data that we have, which again is imperfect and incomplete, that is what we've noticed.
So it's interesting because that seems to be something that's very treatable by adjusting the walk signal, giving the pedestrian greater exclusive priority when they have the walk signal.
That could be a infrastructure and system countermeasure to reduce crash risk, which I think could be discussed at a different time. But I think for this, we'll stay focused on the information to guide the education campaign. But yes, that's absolutely right.
Okay, Brian, I don't see any specific questions in our Q&A section. And so I just wanted to see if if folks were successful in getting to the Menti, please, again, that is, you do see that on the slide. Thank you for adding that. So I'll turn that back to Brian.
Go to the next question if there's no
Oh,
other.
I'm sorry. I do see Mike Smith.
I don't know if you can see or hear me, Suzanne.
We can.
All right. It's actually, the second question is fine for this too. What surprised me was to not hear you talk about little kids. Were you finding generally, because all your age ranges you talked about were older folks or adults, at least university age kids, if you want to call them kids, but not smaller kids, right? Younger.
We looked at every victim by age and compared them to the demographic composition of the city. So we did look at every single age of the victim that was of the overall population of victims, but we didn't see that the school age children were overrepresented in crashes.
All right, thank you. That does surprise me. Thank you.
Right.
Does this crash data include bicyclists, for example, bicyclists crossing a street in a crosswalk, or is it pure pedestrians?
This is pure pedestrians. So we made sure and filtered the crash data based on the victim type. So if there was a miscoding of that victim type, who was a bicyclist but they were coded as a pedestrian, they may have been included. But I think if that was the possibility, the number of those instances will be pretty small.
Okay, and so the efforts here are around purely pedestrian.
That's correct.
Right.
So we did get one answer for the second bullet from Mike. Is there anything in this crash analysis that surprises any of you all? Any more input on that question? Any findings that seem to be surprising or confusing? Approaches?
I was a little surprised not to see crashes occurring end of fall into get dark early. Sidewalks are snowy. People are on kind of unexpected places in the road, are hard to see as they bundle through and maybe don't have all their peripheral vision as a pedestrian bundled up. I also was surprised to see weekends didn't pop in that focus area that includes the stadium, with so many people coming into the city and so many people just walking around.
I would say that for drivers, I was a little surprised to not see teenagers mentioned or even the college student population. And so when you are, that raised a question for me when you mention who's overrepresented or underrepresented. Is that according to population or according to national driver crash trends? Is it, or
That is related to Ann Arbor's population.
okay, so not like, you know, nationwide teenage drivers are more likely to be in crashes. It's just relative to population. Okay.
That's right.
Yep. Something to keep in mind is that teenagers may drive at a lower rate than adults. So teenage drivers, it may be that teenage drivers are more frequently involved in crashes than adult drivers, but teenagers are less likely to drive overall. So there's a pool of teenagers who are not driving. So that could be part of the result and the difference between your perception and the result that we have.
Brian, do you know which year of Ann Arbor population data you're working with? I'm assuming census data.
So yeah, I use census data, and since the crash data timeline was 2015 to 2019, I used 2019 census data.
Okay, I was just thinking the 2020 data was a little problematic for a university town.
Yeah, good point. Jonathan?
The question of what seems to be missing, it's always the perennial challenge of pedestrian safety data, and that is the denominator. We don't know the actual risk, so we could misperceive very, very risky streets as safe if they simply are pedestrian hostile and don't have a lot of pedestrians.
Absolutely.
Second thing that would be doable, I didn't hear anything about season unless I missed it. It would be interesting to hear, given the extremes of weather that we face. Interesting to hear an analysis of season, crashes by season.
We just had crashes by month.
Okay.
And what are the key takeaways here? Lower crash frequencies during the summer months and higher crash frequencies during the spring and the fall. We didn't dive in any deeper than those temporal elements. But great point about exposure. We were unable to account for exposure given the scope of the project. But yes, definitely something that's very important when trying to analyze crash data as it relates to the built environment and lived experiences. And one of the processes that we used to try to kind of get at exposure in a crude way is by when we looked at any of the location specific characteristics like posted speed, functional classification, traffic control devices, we normalized our crash frequencies by the number of those locations as a way of being able to differentiate between crashes that happened at a uncontrolled residential intersection compared to a signalized intersection at an arterial. We can, in some communities, expect a greater share of crash frequencies in residential areas compared to arterials, for exactly your point that you had made, that some arterials can be hostile and discourage pedestrian trips from happening. But by using that approach, we can account for the pedestrian street types for accounting for 90+% of the transportation system compared to collectors and arterials. Moving on to the next one, was there anything in the crash analysis that seems to be misleading? Brett.
I think this is probably a known issue, but you know, driver distraction is typically not known or reported. I guess I was a little surprised to see zero. This goes back to the surprise question, zero alcohol related crashes. But yeah, I think something that might be missing would be driver distraction. Although if it's occurring, if most crashes are occurring at intersections while the vehicle is turning, maybe it's not a distraction issue. We can't just assume it is, but it seems like it's an unknown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Having the reporting officer's ability to prove that a driver was indeed distracted at the time of the crash is extraordinarily difficult. So it's one of those reporting elements that sounds great on paper and very insightful. It's just a very difficult thing for them to actually prove and then it be reflected in the crash data. So that's where conversations like this, where we talk about lived experiences as it relates to crash data, that could certainly be a gap in our data. Ken? Oh, you're muted.
I have a question, or maybe it's a clarification for when you said you normalized or tried to control for traffic controlled intersections.
Mm-hmm.
Does that also include intersections that have crosswalks but don't necessarily have a full traffic signal? Like either ones that have rapid flashing beacons or ones that don't? Because I'm trying to make sense of a couple of the corridors like State Street, where there's a very large section of the street where it looks like everybody's being hit as they're going straight through an intersection. And is there a way to account for, does a pedestrian feel like they have the right of way because they're in the crosswalk, but because it isn't necessarily, I don't think a lot of those have like flashing rapid beacons or stuff like that. Are they walking out into a situation where the driver might not be paying attention?
So unfortunately, our regional data set does not have crosswalk locations or RFB data points. So we weren't able to account for those locations. So that would have been grouped into the uncontrolled or partially controlled intersection denominators.
Yeah, I think Lillian, I'm sorry, Lillian had her hand up as well.
Oh, yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to ask about the converse, I think, of the of what's surprising us. And so I was also surprised that there weren't more younger folks, but I was also surprised, was it surprising to anyone else, the 54 or 50 to 54 being overrepresented? And do we have any reasons why we think that is? Is that who's working in these areas?
That's a great question. And exactly what we're trying to get out of this conversation is your localized understanding and knowledge, something that the data can't answer, something I certainly can't answer. Julie?
Do we have any information about commuters versus local drivers?
We don't have any trip data.
Thanks.
Did Huron Street surprise anyone locally as a high crash area with pedestrians? That one caught me a little by surprise, but it's been many years since I've lived in Ann Arbor. No, everyone was like, yep, expected that one. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that Huron Street, Raymond can correct me if I'm wrong, or anyone else, that it's a MDOT controlled arterial, and so the city doesn't have nearly as much rulemaking capacity on that street.
Did you hear that, Mike Smith from MDOT?
I did want to let the Participants know that there is an open question in the chat that I'd like to read out. Does the data include crashes at crosswalks with flashing rapid beacons? It's been my experiences that most drivers ignore the RRFBs. I've witnessed at least 2 really bad car accidents at the RRFBs because a driver stopped and another car failed to stop.
Yeah, I think Ken had asked a very similar question. No, we don't have RFBs or marked crosswalks in our study data sets. We were using whatever data was available at the regional level so that this approach could be adopted by other similar communities interested in adopting a education campaign such as this.
I wanted to follow up on that to make sure that I'm understanding what the person is describing, the commenter. Are you describing what we often refer to as the multiple threat situation where a pedestrian is crossing, a car stops for that pedestrian, but obstructs sight lines between an oncoming car and the pedestrian so they don't see each other? The pedestrian walks out into the crosswalk and then gets hit? Or are you talking about a vehicle-to-vehicle collision?
So if I am not muted, yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Both. It depends on how wide the street is. Like Huron Street is 4 or 5 lanes, so I think you have more of the multi-threat happening there. Whereas on State Street, it's usually a 2 or 3 lane road, so it's less likely that you're going to have the second driver pulling through and hitting somebody.
So the person in the chat had noted both of those kind of occurrences. For example, at Fuller near the hospital, a car stopped, then another car crashed into the stopped car. And then there's another question. How much of the high crash corridor at Packard and Carpenter is actually on Ann Arbor roads, and how much is on Washtenaw County Road Commission roads? Does the Ann Arbor section of Packard have a high number of crashes?
That would be a follow-up answer. I would have to look at the data to be able to provide an answer to that one. So I will set that one aside and follow up after this meeting.
Thank you.
Mike?
I have a question about that line of questioning, actually. I want to make sure we're not having a communication issue. I take RRFB to stand for Rapid Rectangular Flashing Beacon. That type of signal is not intended to stop traffic. So someone says they're surprised that cars don't stop. They don't stop for that signal. Am I correct? Would someone tell me if I'm off?
Mike, we have a local ordinance, and that local ordinance requires vehicles to stop when someone is approaching the crosswalk.
Well, that would be confusing for out-of-town drivers would be confused then, because the statewide, it's not that way.
And we would love for the statewide to catch up with us.
Either that, or for the purposes of this project, though, it might be one of our things we educate on. Or decide that the city wants to change, or, I mean, do something. And I did send an email, Chelsea, or whoever made the comment about the MDOT signal locations. We absolutely can supply that if we haven't already.
I'm curious how many RFBs the city has.
It's a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember. Raymond, do you remember how many we're up to now? Because I know we've got 6 in design right now.
Okay.
Raymond, you're muted.
I mean,
Yeah, we have that number in our inventory. I can try to find it during the course of this meeting.
I'll also say with RFBs gaining a lot of traction in the last few years with across the nation, some of those locations, even if we did have the data, may not be reflected in our crash data. So if they were installed after a crash happened, we wouldn't be able to account for it. So moving on to the next one, what do we believe to be the top pedestrian safety issues in Ann Arbor? We've heard that there's confusion about RFBs, failing to yield to pedestrians in Ann Arbor, and also let's remember what the framework of this presentation is. We're trying to fill some gaps in the analysis and the data between what's recorded in the data and lived experiences, all of that to inform the development of the safety education campaign. Devin.
Thanks. Yeah, one thing I've heard a lot of people express, and perhaps there's not accidents, but there have been a lot of near accidents, are with obviously right on red turns, and perhaps because it's slow moving traffic, we're able to avoid that. But yeah, I've heard a number of people have been voicing concerns about that, particularly in the downtown area.
Great, thank you.
More than left turns showed up more in the data.
That's what I was actually surprised by.
Yeah.
Because there are so many people that roll up and almost do rolling stops quite often through those reds. But I mean, the data suggests one thing. Anecdotally, though, what I'm hearing from a lot of folks is, yeah, we've had near misses just, on these corners.
I will say it's likely related to reporting issues with right turns generally being a little bit less severe. The speed of the vehicle striking the pedestrians lower on right turns. So I would assume that there'd be less crashes reported to the police department compared to a left turn crash, which has a much higher vehicle speed, thereby having a more severe pedestrian injury outcome. So that could be contributing to that gap between left turn crashes and right turn crashes is just the physics behind it. But great note to include. Brett?
Yeah, I think you said your data set goes up through 2019, right? And I think
right.
it's right around that time or shortly after the city really started implementing a lot of leading pedestrian intervals on the signalized intersections. And so I'm just, maybe it's getting into the solution space, but I'm curious if, you will be looking at or analyzing statistics on intersections that have that feature. And if, I certainly feel as a pedestrian that they're a great addition. So I'm not sure if that would be something that you'll be looking into.
As part of this project, we won't be looking into that. However, I'm not going to say the city of Ann Arbor can't look into it if the LPI data is present or available, but it won't be analyzed as part of this project.
Okay.
The city transportation folks could look at the map of crashes and say, hey, we've done something here because we saw this already in the data and we've changed something that would really help us in a public education space narrow in these areas.
Great point. Seth?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the top of my list for pedestrian safety issues is just speed. Generally, I think a large part, I mean, maybe less so at signalized intersections, but certainly at mid-block crosswalks, a large portion of, I think, our failure to yield problems are speed problems. People don't see, they're going too fast to have space to stop when they see someone. And that's, I think, also with the RRFBs, the flashing lights aren't telling you to stop. They're telling you to look out for pedestrians, and the pedestrian is what's supposed to tell you to stop. But pedestrians are a lot smaller than stop signs. So I think there's a there's an incongruence there. I think one of the other issues, maybe more related to the signalized intersections, is just environments where cars are concerned with interactions with other cars, and that's their primary focus. They're trying to turn left, they're waiting for a gap, and people are moving fast, so they see the gap and they go. They don't see the pedestrian. So, and you're also like looking up at a light, and you're not looking down where the pedestrians are.
That's great. Thank you. Those are two very valid points.
I want to second Seth on speed being the biggest concern. And then a personal favorite of mine is the increased danger to pedestrians from trucks and SUVs compared to lower impact vehicles.
And is this something that you've observed in Ann Arbor as it being, thinking about the physics behind it, trucks, SUVs, more energy there, more weight, the outcome of a crash could be potentially more severe. Have you observed any issues with the operations of these larger vehicles, blind spots, anything like that? I'm sorry, you're muted.
Nothing specific to Ann Arbor, just the general problem with them.
Brian, is the vehicle type given in the crash data? Does it say whether it's a truck or SUV versus a smaller vehicle?
I think it does. I can't recall what we looked at in this analysis. Devin?
Yeah, thanks. Just two more quick thoughts. Going back to, obviously Donnell had asked some questions in the chat about the RRFBs. This is a hypothesis, there's no data. I think maybe because we have had a problem here in town, we've had some fatalities, frankly, in the last 5 years, if my memory serves me right with those, that perhaps there's some pedestrian, more precautions on the pedestrian side and pedestrian education, which is fantastic. But as was illuminated earlier, I have some serious concerns, especially with the volume of people who come in from out of town into Ann Arbor, as well as the transient nature of our city and how many people probably don't even know that by law locally, you need to come to a stop. So that's super critical. And that as a communication point has to happen. And then the other is just as we're considering more around transit oriented work here in town, I spend a lot of time, I live personally along Stadium, and I know at certain hours of the day, I'm very anecdotally speaking as a runner here and a cyclist, how many times I have personally this year, I've lost count of almost gotten hit by left turning cars that try to gun it. And the more people, maybe there's an upside and a downside to this. I don't know. I'm not a transportation planner, but perhaps with more people on the street, more people will be cautious in doing that. But there is a lot of that right now, what I call just kind of like bullet turning in on that left, as you alluded to, with more velocity. And that's a concern to me as we try to activate these spaces and think about that. We're very early in that process, but thinking long term.
That's great, thanks. Yeah, there's this concept called safety in numbers, where as the number of people are walking or cycling at a specific location, the number of crashes per person entering that location reduces. So yeah, valid point.
Devin, I'm wondering from a fellow non-transportation planner who might not use the correct words in this question, do you have any sense if that gunning it at the left turn is happening more often on unprotected lefts where people don't have an arrow, so they're trying to make it whenever there's a gap, or doesn't really matter?
Again, only speaking anecdotally, this is often not at intersections. So these would be like turning into a business. If you're familiar, up and down Stadium, like in the vicinity of Holiday and Demo, and the post offices are really good from that side. Those areas, often too, where you sometimes have traffic blocking and people creeping to get through, and they'll just gun it to avoid getting hit. And especially by the post office where there can be a lot of activity on the street level. So it's not always at the intersection.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other comments related to the top safety pedestrian issues in Ann Arbor? All right. Are there any?
Can I just jump in quick? I just want to make sure that this is on the table. I think it has kind of crept in, but our local ordinance also differs with respect to the crosswalk rules, even if there's no RRFB, that drivers need to stop if there's someone waiting to enter the crosswalk. And many of our drivers seem to be unaware of that requirement.
You know, one of the next steps in this process will be a baseline survey where we can get answers on some of these questions about what drivers know about the law on crosswalks. So that may be clarified further down the road.
So Jim, is that a survey of Ann Arbor residents or also people who commute to Ann Arbor?
I think, well, I think it could be both, but it depends on distribution. And that's something I think we're going to talk about maybe in our next meeting, how to get the baseline survey out. And we'll be trying to get your feedback on the survey itself, whether questions need to be added or modified. But yeah, so it would really have to do with distribution and sort of the circumstances. In Ann Arbor, it sounds like it would be important to hear back from people who live outside of town, but who drive into town for various reasons.
Right. I think that group is hard to reach. It's easy to sort of survey the people who live in town and harder to figure out how to survey the commuters.
On the issue of adherence to Ann Arbor's crosswalk law, I think maybe we can focus on behavior as opposed to knowledge. So it's a relatively easy matter to assess adherence on the part of the drivers to the crosswalk law. Lack of adherence might be for lack of knowledge, or it might be they know but they don't care. I'm not sure that the treatment, the educational treatment, is all that different. So the problem is lack of adherence, and the educational treatment anyway has to be make sure that people can't ignore the fact that we do have our crosswalk law here.
But I think we have to remember what Seth said, that if you're driving it fast enough, you just don't have time to stop once you've noticed the pedestrian, because it's too hard to notice the pedestrian standing there if you're zipping down the road at a certain speed. So it comes back to speed again as a really important piece of this.
Okay, great points. So we heard that engaging with the commuter population, out-of-town population would be a benefit to the safety education campaign. Are there any other groups, target audiences in Ann Arbor or the surrounding areas that would be good to engage or target?
I mean, I think I've noticed that regarding our crosswalk law, as far as I've noticed, the only visible sign that Ann Arbor might be different from other cities is actually not. It's the vertical plastic signs in our crosswalks. Some of our crosswalks that say stop for pedestrian and crosswalk, which actually doesn't capture our actual crosswalk law, which is stop for pedestrian even waiting to cross the street. I understand that there's a problem of standard traffic control devices. You can't just make up a traffic control device, and I think that's the reason behind that language. However, I think that there's a possibility of greater signage around town to inform, not as traffic control devices, but maybe it's in the entrance to town. Maybe together with listing our sister cities, we also list, oh, and you have to drive differently here in Ann Arbor. So I think we've never actually done that, and I'd be interested in education that where the environment itself speaks to people, rather than people get paper or electronic communications that maybe or they may or may not see. But when the environment speaks to people, I think there's a greater potential effect.
Seth?
Yeah, I think there's also, I mean, yeah, I feel like whatever, like billboards when you come into town or whatever, just to notify people of this environment. But I also think there's confusion generally among folks about the territory of the road and how I think, well, I guess I don't know numbers. I'm guessing that a lot of people feel that the road is the territory of the car, and the crosswalks is where pedestrians can get in or whatever, can pass through that territory. Whereas I think the law is more, and especially in Ann Arbor, that the territory is for everybody. And if you are crossing at a crosswalk, the cars yield to pedestrians. And if you're crossing anywhere else, you yield to the cars. And it's this, where do we respect each other? And so we respect the cars where there aren't crosswalks, and where there are crosswalks, they respect us as pedestrians. So I don't know if there's something short and sweet that can get that across, but because I'm like, if drivers think that pedestrians should only cross in the crosswalks, then there's not much. Well, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. Well, I'll stop there. If it comes to me, I'll put it in the chat.
So can I ask a question to you then, Seth? Do you think that holds true though for smaller roads in the more dense areas of town? Like when we get around the university, does it feel like on State Street that crosswalks are only for people, or it kind of feels like the whole block does? So are you talking more about like a street design type thing of trying to figure out basically in different areas throughout the city, how do we take some of those treatments that we put in the high pedestrian areas and applying them to possibly to other areas around the city?
I guess I'm not sure. I guess my thought is, if you're not going to yield to me at the crosswalk, what's the point of the crosswalk? If I have to yield to you at the crosswalk, then I can yield to you anywhere along the road. So there's no point in having a crosswalk if there isn't yielding going on. So, and I think, I mean, ideally, I feel like all the crosswalks and the RFPs and all the signs is trying to solve the speed problem. Whereas if we solve the speed problem, it wouldn't be an issue because people aren't going so fast. So it's easier for folks to stop, and it's easier to do all of your movements and get into traffic, and there's a lot less gunning it and people not being seen and all that stuff. So.
Fair points. So going back to the target audience, anyone missing that we haven't had previously mentioned during this meeting? Anyone you think is important according to your lived experiences or to some of the findings that we had presented on? Seth?
Maybe just residents. And I would say students, but I don't remember in all your statistics, I don't remember how much of that was student ages, but I don't know if like the university gives students any information about anything regarding driving around town. So maybe through the university is one tack, and then just city residents or employers in town, maybe to catch people who don't live here.
Yeah, I think around the university 20 to 29, I think that's the age cohort that was overrepresented, so very appropriate. Devin?
Thanks. Yeah, I was just going to echo that with the local community, and probably through a variety of means. Some of that could be just very heavily promoting information via social, like literally ads and stuff like that. That I think is super critical, getting this out there. I also think that just in general, there's a lot of confusion about various different things transportation oriented in this town. We're trying to do some smart things, and I think sometimes we're a little ahead of the curve, and maybe our nose is a little out in front of the surfboard for some. So just that notion of why we're doing this, and echoing back to safety, I think when people begin to understand that we're trying to be a safer community, not trying to be completely anti-car, that it starts to resonate. But there is a lot of concern and misinformation being perpetuated. So I do think our local community very heavily needs to be reminded of this stuff, and in some ways educated from zero.
Jonathan?
What do we know, what do the data show about effectiveness of safety education campaigns in general? And then within that, what kind of campaigns are effective? So I imagine that safety education has been itself a topic of studies, and it'd be interesting to know what we've learned from the research there.
Jim, have we completed that task as part of this project?
We've done some preliminary work on that. We were kind of waiting to see what emerged from these meetings to do some further research on pedestrian safety education campaigns. From our preliminary research, there are certain types of campaigns that tend to be more successful than other types of campaigns. I think, just from the previous experience of driving change, campaigns that focus on key populations and issues tend to be more successful than those that don't. I think also a result of the research that I've seen is that campaigns that are focused on specific locations and messaging in that location tend to be more successful than those that are more broad and diffuse. I think there are types of messaging that it depends on the community, of course, but types of messaging that tends to work better than other types of messaging. Like sometimes a scare messaging that's based on kind of fear and trying to motivate people that way sometimes doesn't work so well depending on the population. This is a while ago that we did this preliminary research, but that's what I'm remembering.
Are there any final points, comments, additions before I hand this back to Mary?
I was I'm going to jump in here, wondering if either Chelsea or Mike wanted to comment on what worked in driving change, or other things you've been involved with. So.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment a little bit on that. So with kind of public education rule messaging like driving change, which was bicyclist and motorist focused within the city limits of Grand Rapids, the campaign ran 3 summers in a row, 14, 15, and 16, with a little bit of a budget difference there and how much frequency that message was getting out. We saw in consumer surveys that had representative samples that we had significant increases in understanding that the new 5-foot passing rule was in effect. belief that everyone belongs on the road, that this is somewhere where you're supposed to be sharing space. So both sentiment and knowledge of rules increased in a survey-based land. Actual crash data is a lagging measure, which makes it hard to respond with public education messaging, but we saw a significant drop our first year. So 2014, there was a 50% reduction in bicyclist motorist crashes within the city limits. But that wasn't maintained in the second year. It did come back up. It was still below the mean average. In 2016, I think returned to the average. So it's hard to know because there's a lot of other factors that influence any given bicycling season. 2014, I can't quite remember now, but did we have a lot of nice riding days? Was it 100 degrees every day? Did it rain every weekend? All of that impacts the crash data. So it's really hard to tie public education, and especially public education that is blanketing a city, to the crash metrics. But we did see knowledge and reported behavior changes, as well as positive signs within the crash data that we would like to hang success hats on for that. I'd speak a little to what Jim mentioned earlier on type of messaging and audience mattering. The research we did in Grand Rapids showed a fear messaging in particular resonated strongly with people under 30, while anyone over 30 said, oh my gosh, don't show that to me. I hate it. It doesn't change my behavior. Oh my gosh. We did a similar 20-something-year-old driver work on motorcycle safety, and Greater Grand Rapids 20-something-year-old drivers reacted very positively, or oh my gosh, I need to change my behavior, to fear-based messaging, while those in the Metro Detroit region said, nah, don't even waste your time on that. I don't care about it. There was a very present divide between different regions and mindsets when it came to driving and driving behavior that we incorporated into the campaign for that one. So I think I've wandered away because you asked me for research-based questions, and I had lots of things to share.
Thanks, Chelsea. Mike, I see you turned on your camera. Did you have anything that you wanted to say?
Yeah, I was clicking it a little bit. It wasn't coming through for me, sorry. But thank you for going right ahead and doing what I was going to do, which was have Chelsea talk.
Yeah.
I was going to tell the group here, that's why we have a nationwide expert firm like Good Marketing to help us with those words. And as Chelsea just eloquently described, that's their wheelhouse for getting the right message to be understood the right way. And I would add to the general conversation in Grand Rapids for driving change. The campaign was for 2014, 15, and 16, but we studied the crash data through 19. We found a sustained reduction even after the campaign for years, plural, which is amazing to find in this type of work, completely amazing. And she mentioned some double-digit changes. We also had a tremendous reduction in the fatality rate there. I'm thinking, Chelsea, without having it in front of me, that we went from an average there of 11 fatalities on a bike per year to an average of 1 to 0, sustained after that.
You would be better than me on that one. I was heavy all the data for 14 and 15. So I'm glad to hear the trends continue. That's awesome.
Yes, FHWA took interest in that and had me present in 2018 or 19 to the Michigan Division of Federal Highways Administration. And so they asked us to have the data updated, which we did. I forget if it was in-house or with someone from your company, but we did get the flyer redone in 2019. And that's how I remember that we were just hoping that it did prove it in the data that even out of campaign, the crash improvements, the reduction in total crashes, reduction in fatalities, and reduction in serious injuries, all were sustained. And the city did other things too, like the Ann Arbor folks are talking about. They also changed ordinances. They also had unique things to their city outside of state law, or in addition to, however you want to say it. And you at Good Marketing, you manage that. you managed the right words so that when we said something was a state law, it was, and if it wasn't, if it was local, you worded it correctly, you know, and made it make sense to the audience. And so, and it's also a university town there with transient nature. So, you know, you managed it there. I have every confidence it can happen here.
Thanks, Mike. So we are at the end of our meeting time, correct, Suzanne?
That is correct. I did build in a little extra time just in case, because I didn't want to have the webinar cut off right at 8. Just in case.
And so I believe the next meeting that Jim alluded to, where we'll talk about some baseline information, and then we will also at Tool Design and Good Marketing and Michigan Fitness Foundation kind of put our heads together and make some recommendations that the committee can look at our next meeting, which I have on my calendar for August 16th at 6:30. Is that correct, Suzanne?
At 5.
Oh,
at 5 to
o'clock?
6:30. 5 to 6:30. Yes.
Thank you.
And I did want to remind everyone about that.
Is that going to be on Zoom again? Is it possible to send the calendar invites via Zoom?
Yeah.
So that, yeah.
I do sincerely apologize that when we originally set the date, we had done this so far in advance. I wanted this to get on folks' calendars. Lesson learned on my part. Yeah, so that will be fixed and rectified for everyone's convenience. And just as a reminder, we will be splitting our time between some follow-up work with Michigan Fitness Foundation and the Sam Schwartz consulting team at that meeting. So it will be a pretty packed agenda.
So thanks so much, everyone, for being here tonight. Your input has been invaluable, and we look forward to continuing this discussion. And I do know that Suzanne does know how to reach us. So if you want to communicate directly with us, Suzanne has our permission to share our contact information.
All right.
I think we're done. Have a good evening.
So. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.